In the period immediately after his crucifixion, the followers of Jesus numbered barely 100. They were a persecuted underground cult on the verge of annihilation. Yet within a few decades, this cult had thousands of followers throughout the Roman Empire. It had spread through mighty cities like Ephesus, where earlier pagan worshippers had built the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Christianity swept away these old beliefs. It traveled as far as the deserts of Turkey to Cappadocia, where a mysterious people carved underground cities and extraordinary churches from volcanic rock. In the beginning, the message of Christianity was carried on the roads that Rome had built for its soldiers by one man, a preacher named Paul. In his life, Paul may have walked 20,000 miles, bringing spiritual change and upheaval wherever he went. Now, using the latest research and computer graphic imaging, a team of experts will attempt to reveal the world that he knew and the places that he traveled to and transformed. This is the lost world of St. Paul and the first Christians. '36 AD. In the city of Jerusalem, Jewish leaders were doing everything in their power to crush a dangerous new cult, the cult of Christ. Just 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion, only a handful of his followers survived. If they could all be killed, their religion would die too. A conservative Jewish teacher presided over this persecution. His name was Saul. He personally supervised the execution by stoning of one of the Christian leaders. Yet in time, this man would become Jesus' greatest messenger. More than half of the New Testament is comprised of his writings. Many argue that without him, there would be no Christianity. Saul became Paul and shaped the Christian world. Now our experts want to uncover the world that shaped him. Paul's story began in southwest Turkey, in his hometown of Tarsus. It's still a busy town today, but historian Mark Wilson wants to find traces of the city that Paul knew and that helped mold this extraordinary man.
It lies in a very fertile plain with much agriculture in the area. Textile production is prevalent in the area as well. So as you look around Tarsus today, it's a very prosperous and booming city.
It's become a site of Christian pilgrimage.
This is the area in Tarsus where Paul lived, and all pilgrims to the city visit this area.
It's widely believed that this well was in use 2,000 years ago and that Paul drank its water.
This would have been a water source for his family. And because of this, many people believe this is holy water in the well.
Paul wrote little about his hometown, but other sources reveal a significant fact. Tarsus once stood on the shores of the Mediterranean. The sea has since receded several miles, but this was once a major port.
In the first century, it was a very bustling city on a major crossroads and also a noted university town, the Athens of the East.
Not far from Paul's well, new evidence has emerged that gives further insight into life here at that time. Recently, building works were stopped when workers found ancient ruins buried beneath the town center. Examining the find, archaeologists realized they had discovered a row of shops, a commercial district dating back to the 1st century, Paul's time. The walls of this excavation pit reveal layer upon layer of artifacts left by the successive generations who lived here. But it was the discovery of a street at the bottom of the pit that provided the biggest clue. It was a paved road, and it was dead straight. Only one civilization built roads like this: the Romans. Local archaeologist Nadia Durgan points out other evidence of Roman occupation.
You can see the rain gutters each side of the road.
Oh, amazing.
Yes,
Look at those.
the white stones. and it's visible. There are a lot of wheel traces on the road, wheel tracks. You know, carriages, coaches use the road.
Tarsus was a wealthy port. That made it an attractive target for the Romans, who occupied it in the decades before Paul's birth. The Roman presence would have been a major influence on the way he was brought up.
This street is amazing because the young Paul probably played and walked along this street when he was a boy growing up in this city.
Archaeological investigations enable us to recreate what ancient Tarsus might have looked like. This was a busy commercial center. Paul would have come into contact with people of different nationalities and religions.
Perhaps Paul came down here and bought some groceries or traded in produce. His family, of course, were leather workers, tent makers, and they would have worked down in this central area of the city as well.
Tradition has it that his family were craftsmen and traders. They certainly had the means to give him a privileged education. He was raised a strict Jew and called by the Jewish name of Saul. But he was also a Roman citizen, a fact that would prove advantageous throughout his life. And he was taught Greek, which at that time was the language of international diplomacy. Saul grew up as part of the establishment, a member of the learned Jewish elite. His first taste of travel was to Jerusalem, where he went as part of his education. This was where he first encountered the followers of Jesus, a young revolutionary teacher whose popular support was making him a threat to the authorities. To Saul, Jesus was the enemy.
In fact, he was so zealous that he was involved in persecuting this new cult of people who were following Jesus as the Messiah.
There is no evidence that Saul ever met Jesus, but we do know that he considered his teachings blasphemous, and that after Jesus' crucifixion, he devoted his life to wiping out Jesus' followers.
This was basically a nascent group that was forming in cities throughout Palestine, and Paul thought if he could kill and deprive these communities of their leadership, perhaps he could snuff out this new religion.
It is this background, conservative, traditional, violently anti-Christian, that makes the story of Paul's conversion all the more remarkable. The New Testament says that he pursued a group of Jesus followers who had fled to the city of Damascus. On the road, he was struck down by a blinding light. It said that Jesus appeared to him in a vision and that Saul repented, transforming himself from that moment into a messenger of the gospel.
Well, certainly his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus was the beginning of his own spiritual journey. Here, the persecutor now becomes the ardent follower of Jesus as the risen Lord.
He continued on to Damascus, where he was baptized and took the name of Paul. He then began a journey that would last the rest of his life and cover an estimated 20,000 miles. It was made easier by the enormous network of Roman roads.
We're walking along a section of Roman road about 10 miles north of Tarsus. This gives us a good idea of what Paul experienced as he traveled along these roads throughout the eastern Mediterranean region.
The roads were constructed by the Roman army to make long-distance travel as fast as possible. Without them, it would have been impossible to govern the vast and growing empire.
The remarkable preservation of a Roman road like this shows how well they were made. We're looking here at the original stone pavement called the metalling that was on the surface of the road, as well as the original curbing.
Roman roads were built to a strict formula. First a trench was dug, then packed with boulders and sand to create a solid base. This was covered with layers of smaller stones and clay. Paving stones, often made of basalt, were laid on top. They were sloped, so that rainwater would run into the guttering at each side. Paul began his mission in Antioch, the provincial capital of Syria. His followers there were the first people to be called Christians. Paul kept moving, visiting all the big cities of the region. He sought the places where the old religions were most powerful. He would preach his message in the shadow of the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, and the biggest pagan temple on earth. In 52 AD, Paul came to Ephesus, the fourth largest city in the ancient world. He was just one of tens of thousands of pilgrims visiting the city. Most had come to venerate the goddess Artemis.
Artemis was the goddess of the hunt. She was also the protectress of virgins. And we know that during the yearly festivals, this was a time when the young unmarried women would find their spouses.
Artemis was one of the most important gods in the Greek pantheon. Here she had a shrine to match her status. The Temple of Artemis was known far and wide. Its image was even molded onto the coins that circulated the region. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world, and in Paul's time, the largest temple in existence. As a magnet for pagan pilgrims, it played a key role in Paul's plan.
Ephesus became a wonderful base for him because the Temple of Artemis was here, and he used it for his own benefit because the many people who came into the city to participate in the various festivities were an audience for him to preach the gospel to.
Our experts will reconstruct the Temple of Artemis as Paul would have seen it. The evidence suggests that the people of Ephesus used revolutionary construction techniques. But all that remains today are a few marble blocks, recovered from beneath 20 feet of silt.
To build this temple required a monumental task. Not only did they have to build it, they needed to figure out how to build it. They'd never done anything like this before.
In their desire to honor the goddess, the temple's builders and engineers set themselves a challenging task. They decided to build the temple entirely from marble, and the nearest source of marble lay 8 miles away. It all had to be transported back to the construction site. Archaeologist Julian Bennett investigates how it was done.
Gangs of men would be working with metal chisels and hammers all the way around to create a narrow trough less than 6 inches wide. We can still see the surviving trough there. And then once they got the channel down to the level of the block they wanted, you came from the side, you hit it with steel wedges, and the block would lift off.
It's estimated that 51,000 tons of marble were needed to build the temple. But the Ephesians didn't do the hard work themselves. They delegated it to slaves and criminals.
A common punishment for crime was to be sentenced to work in the quarries. You weren't expected to live too long, and you probably didn't.
Once they'd carved out the blocks, they still had to move them to the temple site. Today, quarrymen rely on heavy machinery. A few hundred yards from the ancient quarry, grey marble is still being extracted from the same site. The average block is 13 tons, about the same size as the blocks used to build the Temple of Artemis.
Today, a machine makes it look easy. When the temple was built, sheer manpower.
The temple architects used innovative methods to speed up the process. They invented a technique that would make them better stone movers than the Egyptians. They turned the square blocks into wheels. Wooden cradles were built around the cut rock so that it could easily be rolled the 8 miles to the temple site. Once they had the raw materials, they set about building one of the greatest temples the world has ever seen. In its heyday, it attracted more pilgrims than the Temple of the Jews in Jerusalem. Today, the site where it once stood is a flooded marsh. It's hard to imagine why such a large temple would be constructed here, on land no modern builder would touch. The Roman historian Pliny claimed that the marshy ground was chosen as a precaution against frequent earthquakes. It would cushion the tremors. Another theory is that a meteor landed here. The ancients, thinking it was a god sent from the heavens, constructed their temple around it. The location presented the builders with a serious problem: how to construct a great temple in a swamp. They started by creating a dry base, treading down a layer of charcoal, then covering it with sheep fleeces to prevent water rising. Slate blocks were placed on top. The floor of slate and marble was built 8 feet high to stay above the water level. It spanned an area 255 feet wide by 425 feet long. This sturdy platform supported a forest of columns. This one is 45 feet high, but Pliny wrote that the originals were a massive 60 feet, 6 stories tall. To achieve this ambitious engineering task, the architects used scaffolding. They assembled the columns from a series of stacked drums, each weighing more than 8 tons. A column consisted of around 30 drums. Once assembled, they were fluted with hammer and chisel. This was done 127 times. Among the ruins, Erin Marshall looks for evidence of how the temple roof was built.
So, having gotten the columns up, now you have the task of actually erecting the lintels. The lintels are all of those stone blocks which you have to put on top of the columns.
Again, it's Pliny who tells us how the lintels were positioned. It was crucial to get it precisely right.
What they did was they erected a ramp of reed bags all the way up to the level of the top of the columns. Then they placed the lintels on top of them and then poked a hole in the reed bag so all the sand came out. Slowly enough so that the lintels could be adjusted. And you have to bear in mind, these aren't mortared. They have to be exact.
It took 120 years to complete the temple. We can now bring to life this incredible part of Paul's lost world, an astonishing building that was bigger than anything that had gone before. It was the focal point of much activity, all centered around the cult of the goddess. An opening in the roof bathed her statue in light. The cult of Artemis was by no means the city's only religion. The Romans believed in many gods, and they tolerated the traditional beliefs of the people they conquered. So at first, Paul and his new religion were well received. A few miles from the temple, in the city center, Paul discovered something that would allow him to deliver his message to an audience of unprecedented size.
We're entering one of the most spectacular buildings in Ephesus. 25,000 people came here for games and for protest. St. Paul entered here.
The city's theater, also built from white marble, was being extended while Paul was in the city. 459 feet across, containing 66 rows of seats, it was once the largest theater in the land.
Paul would have come here and addressed one of the biggest audiences of his life.
This was the perfect theater. It seated 25,000 people, and the acoustics allowed for a dramatic impact.
The superb acoustics resulted from the design of the theater seating.
These seats are wider, and the further up you go, they're narrower. And this concave shape helps to retain the sound in the theater.
But the theater was not designed simply for speeches and plays. The partition that shielded the front row indicates that Paul shared his stage with more dangerous entertainment.
The wall is high to protect the spectators from the death, from the blood and the guts of what went on here.
The recent discovery of a dedicated graveyard in Ephesus confirmed that this theater was an arena where gladiators fought. These immensely popular contests drew large audiences, and as far as Paul was concerned, the gladiator games enabled even more people to hear his message. Because what separated Paul from Jesus' other disciples was that he didn't just target Jews, he aimed to convert people of all faiths. His methods would help make Christianity a worldwide religion and would eventually contribute to the fall of the Roman Empire. And yet it was the Romans' own engineering skill that gave Paul the opportunity he needed. Paul lived and preached in Ephesus, part of modern-day Turkey, for 2.5 years. The largest city in Roman Asia, with an open-minded and cosmopolitan population, it was an ideal place to seek new converts. Archaeologist Julian Bennett discovers that the way that the Romans built their towns gave Paul a unique opportunity to introduce huge numbers of people to Christianity. But he also finds that this city had its eye fixed on more worldly pursuits than theology and a new religion.
Well, every Roman city would have had a brothel. This was an everyday fact of Roman life.
Paul was in a city with a reputation for pleasure-seeking.
A male-dominated society when a young man would not marry until he was in his mid-20s or 30s. A place like Ephesus, a harbour city, would have had several brothels.
Right in the center of town, early archaeologists found an intriguing signpost that featured a foot and a heart.
This particular building, when they excavated it in the 19th century, they found a number of oil lamps here with scenes of erotic art on them, and also an inscription referring to young people. And so the excavators came to the natural conclusion this was the main brothel of Ephesus. It occupies such a prominent corner.
Prostitution was an important source of income for the Roman administration.
We even know that the prostitutes paid a tax to the city and to the government, and that this tax was the equivalent of one sexual act, and they had to pay this tax every month.
But it wasn't all about pleasure. The fundamental challenge for the city's administrators was providing basic amenities for over 200,000 people. The most important was running water. The city's source was 8 miles away in the Marnas Valley. Diverting it to Ephesus required an extraordinary feat of engineering.
Well, here we have it. This is the aqueduct bridge for Roman Ephesus. This was built something like 2,000 years ago, before the time of St. Paul's visit here, but it's still in incredibly good condition.
Building an aqueduct this size cost more than the city could afford. This gave ambitious politicians an opportunity to curry favor with the masses.
It gives us the name of the man, Gaius Sextilius Pollio, with his wife, and also their son, for the people of Ephesus. Sua pecunia facundum curavit. We pay for this from our own pockets. It's a way of making certain the people of Ephesus remember who you are. Or perhaps more to the point, when election time comes round again, remember my stepson.
Whatever their motives, the individuals who paid for projects like this did a great service for the city. Pollio's aqueduct carried vital water supplies to Ephesus, where they entered an elaborate system.
This is precisely the sort of thing we're looking for when following an aqueduct. And they're absolutely jam-packed with calcium carbonate. It's calcium that's been dissolved out of the water, coming down with the aqueduct through these limestone hills, come into the city somewhere in this area, onto this structure. And over here, a section which has been broken loose. If I can lift this, and you have the flange at the one end, the socket at the other end. The flange would always be on the downstream side. So, a very good example of Roman technology.
Pipes like these ran in a network down the hill. There were 100 gallons a day for each Ephesian, comparable to the provision made in most modern cities. Paul and most other citizens got their water from communal fountains, but some buildings were supplied directly. One was the bathhouse. The Roman baths were the focal point of the city's social life. Here the Ephesians discussed politics, philosophy, and religion. Christianity spread by word of mouth, and it was in places like this that Paul's message began to reach a wider audience. The bathhouses were equipped with the latest technology, including an underfloor heating system called a hypocaust.
And we are, in fact, very lucky at this particular point. This is a very good preserved cross-section of a typical hypocaust system. So you can see the pillars here which support the main floor, a very thick, very hard pink Roman plaster known as opus signinum. It retains heat. On top of this, we're very lucky, marble slabs from the floor.
Hot air filled the underfloor space, spreading up the walls to heat the room from all sides. Hot water was piped into the bath. The dirty water from the bathhouse was also put to good use. It flushed out waste from other buildings. And next door was one of the most important facilities found in any large Roman city.
And sure enough, a really nice Roman public latrine. Marble seats, nice and cool in the summer, not so nice perhaps in the winter. And you'd sit here next to your neighbour, talk about the weather, gladiatorial games, what life was like. You have a nice little water trough in front because the Romans did not have toilet paper. Instead, every Roman carried a personal sponge, and they would have the sponge on the end of a stick, dip it in the end of the water, and now you see what this is for.
Our evidence for this comes from an unusual source.
We are told that one gladiator, rather than go out and fight his opponent, decided to commit suicide, and he did so by making the excuse of going to the latrine and grabbing hold of a sponge and choking himself to death with this. So that's how we know about the sponges.
While Paul would have used these public lavatories, wealthy citizens had the privacy of their own luxury latrines. Today, the remains of these lavish houses are protected in a climate-controlled shelter. Paul would have seen them being built and furnished in exotic marble brought from across the Roman Empire to demonstrate their owner's wealth. Each house had a private lavatory flushed by a continuous flow from the aqueduct system.
This is a very high-quality latrine, small private latrine. We know in Rome, at least, we assume in Ephesus as well, they had different size water pipes, and they calculated the tax you paid by the size of your water pipe. So to have a private toilet like this is very much a sign of status.
The wealthiest households could even afford an early form of air conditioning, walls of water.
You needed water every day just to stay alive. You need water for washing, for cooking, but it helps to cool down the air as well. So all in all, this must have been an extremely pleasant place to be in, especially in the middle of the summer.
The Ephesian ruling classes enjoyed a high quality of life. But suddenly, Paul's preaching threatened to disrupt that. Not only did he undermine their pagan beliefs, he also endangered the city's most important trade. Religion was big business in early Ephesus. Its market lured pilgrims to the temple. Silver statuettes of the goddess Artemis sold as charms brought in vast revenue. But the arrival of Christianity meant that people were turning their backs on Ephesus. 25,000 people gathered in the great theater to hear a silversmith called Demetrius speak. He told them that Paul was not only insulting their goddess, but also threatening their main source of income. He stirred the crowd to the point where an anti-Christian riot erupted. Tradition has it that to appease the angry mob, Paul was thrown into prison. It's thought that it was here that he wrote some of the letters that later became part of the New Testament. On his release, he was told to leave Ephesus. But his new religion had already taken hold. The pagan city was becoming a city of Christians. And the silversmith Demetrius was right. Ephesus would decline along with the cult of Artemis. It was the beginning of a long, slow collapse that would eventually see the temple fall into ruin. Paul moved on. His message would have an equally powerful effect elsewhere. It would travel to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, transforming every community it touched. We investigate a religious society that sprang up in Paul's wake. In the strange land of Cappadocia, a mysterious group of Christians sought safety by building a secret world underground. $15 million years ago, a series of volcanic eruptions around the Mediterranean threw up immense clouds of ash, blanketing the land, layer upon layer. Over time, this created a strange, otherworldly place. Today, it is called Cappadocia. Some scholars believe that Paul came here to preach his new religion. Our experts are trying to understand the part that this alien landscape may have played in the birth of Christianity. The best way to see what traces remain is from the air. It is a vast area, dotted with sculpted cones, pyramids, and obelisks. The ash is up to 300 feet thick. Each layer is of a different consistency, and erosion by wind and rain has created a remarkable uneven terrain. Early explorers thought that the shapes must have been carved by some ancient race. The buildings display the skill and craftsmanship of a highly sophisticated people. Their work can still be seen and remains impressive.
We see some steps there leading up to somebody's habitation. It's an incredibly gorgeous place. Beautiful.
The word Cappadocia derives from the Persian for land of beautiful horses. The Cappadocians were famed as suppliers of prize animals for the Roman army. Down on the ground, Veronica Callas chooses the best form of local transport and heads for the Ilara Valley, a canyon cut deep into the ash. There she finds an extraordinary concentration of ancient churches carved into the rock face. There are over 100 of them in this 10-mile valley alone. It's clear that Paul's message had an immense impact. The churches are decorated with frescoes that depict stories from the New Testament. Veronica wants to trace Paul's story back further. She heads for a settlement a few miles north of the canyon to try to discover how the early Cappadocians lived. What Paul would have seen was an extraordinary community of cave dwellers. This settlement has long been abandoned, but its inhabitants left behind tantalizing glimpses of their lives.
It's a large square room, and it has a conical vault that leads up into a ventilation shaft.
There is a chimney, so fires were lit here.
This is most likely where they cooked. This is an oven with fire burning down below and perhaps a grill.
Another room reveals evidence of industry.
This is known as a pit loom, and this is a fine example where you might have a wooden frame erected around the sitter's lap in order to weave textiles.
There are also pits for storing clay jugs or amphoras. Using these clues, sculpted 2,000 years ago from ash, Veronica is building up a picture of what the Cappadocians were like.
The people who lived here were said to be very rugged, the cowboys of the empire. And there's a story that when a viper would bite a Cappadocian, the viper would die. This is how tough the Cappadocians were.
And yet, living on the trade route between Europe and Asia, these people were becoming wealthy. The Cappadocians' lifestyle was sophisticated and comfortable. This large ceremonial hall indicates the high status of the people that lived here. Most of the ancient world's freestanding buildings crumbled away long ago, but Cappadocia's volcanic ash retains a unique record of its architecture. It offers a tantalizing glimpse of the lost world in which Paul lived, and there is clear evidence that his religion gained a foothold here.
This is a really nice church. It's in a basilica style with columns and piers and arcades separating this very large barrel-vaulted nave from side aisles, and here we're entering into the sanctuary where the altar should be.
Although these columns appear to have been built from stones, they were actually cut from the volcanic ash. Their elaborate style mimics the building techniques of the time. Ash is easily worked with simple tools, but hollowing out a sophisticated home like this one would have taken many months and a great deal of skill and planning. Veronica has analyzed each of the 15 rooms here, and now, using computer graphics, we can recreate the complex structure of this settlement. This residence is the largest and most elaborate in Cappadocia. It covers 3,000 square yards. The kitchen, ceremonial halls, and church mark it out as an estate for the elite. it was home to a large, aristocratic, and publicly Christian family. This place is part of Paul's legacy. The architectural details of the church of Domush Kadir have been remarkably well preserved. They give us a rare insight into how early Christians worshipped.
This is a nice representation of the kind of church that emerged immediately after St. Paul's times. There are no paintings here, and yet the architecture is very, very elegant. You can imagine what an amazing place this would have been around the 4th to the 6th century. This is known as an ambo. That is a pulpit. This is a very important feature in early Christian churches. So this is the closest thing we have to the time of St. Paul. They mostly stood then. It seems that people prayed with their hands open and their chest up to the sky, not bowing down and closed.
The congregation would have stood around the ambo in the nave, facing the altar in the central apse. To their left and right were side aisles containing a baptismal font. Behind them was the church entrance, the narthex. Today, it is lined with empty tombs. But it was not always easy for the Cappadocians to follow their Christian faith. The more the early church grew, the more it was seen as a threat. So it literally went underground. We reveal the extraordinary subterranean world created by the Cappadocians to provide shelter and safety for tens of thousands of people. For 30 years, Paul traveled the Roman world, spreading the message of Christianity. His journey entered its final phase in Jerusalem. Around 60 AD, he was arrested for a breach of Jewish law. He faced death, but exercised his right as a Roman citizen to go on trial in Rome itself. This was a dangerous gamble. The Roman Emperor Nero saw Christians as a threat.
By the mid-60s, the situation of the Christians in Rome was quite precarious. The Romans recognized that they were not a sect of Judaism, but were a separate religion.
And when fire engulfed the city, destroying hundreds of buildings, Nero needed someone to blame.
After the fire in Rome in 64, Nero was looking for a convenient scapegoat, and he pointed to the Christians as the cause of the fire, and this brought great persecution.
Paul was well known as a Christian leader. It's said that Nero singled him out and had him beheaded. But he couldn't kill Paul's message. In the lands where he had preached, the Christian faith had taken root, and gradually, over centuries, Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. In 313 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian. The pagan gods were swept aside, their temples destroyed and replaced with the first Christian churches. But that golden age for Christianity was short-lived. The fate of the empire and the church had become entwined. Christianity grew while Rome remained strong. But when Rome declined, her enemies became the church's enemies. This change in fortunes was felt even by the remote, cave-dwelling Christians of Cappadocia. By the 5th century AD, as Rome fell, they found themselves at the mercy of Arab warlords. They had no means to fight back, so they took an incredible course of action. In their tens of thousands, Cappadocia's Christians went underground. It wasn't until the 1960s that this extraordinary story was revealed. The chance find of a secret passageway led to a series of discoveries. Beneath this landscape are hundreds of miles of man-made tunnels. Their entrances are incredibly well hidden, but opening these cunningly concealed doorways gives us a new insight into the story of the early Christians. Investigations have revealed that the tunnels formed self-contained settlements with all the features of a sophisticated society. People survived underground thanks to ingenious ventilation shafts carved into the rock.
It's quite amazing. If you stand here, you feel a breeze, and we are several meters underneath ground level. In fact, they reach the water table, so these function both as ventilation shafts and as wells to pump water from down below. We have a large square, what looks like a room, but in fact it's a bin for grapes, and the grapes would be pressed. And so wine, the liquid from pressing, would come through here and then be deposited in this rock-cut space here.
Life underground would not have been easy. It's difficult to imagine how these people survived without seeing the sun.
They didn't have a sense of day and night down there, and I think that must have created some very strange psychology in people.
They were clearly desperate. They secured the entrances to these complexes with heavy, wheel-like doors. Some remain sealed to this day. And 2 stories down, there is evidence of what drove them here.
This is what looks like an altar. We don't really know why this is here in the middle. The altar usually is in the apse. 2 apses side by side. That's how we know that it's a church.
They had been forced underground because of their faith, so it was natural that they would build altars to worship. 40 settlements like this one have been discovered. The largest is 8 stories deep, sinking 90 yards underground with 20 miles of tunnels. It's believed that up to 20,000 people could have hidden in this complex alone, and it's thought that there are many more such networks still to be found. It would be another 5 centuries before peace returned to this region. For over 300 years, Christians used these tunnels and endured enormous hardship to preserve their faith. That faith was St. Paul's legacy.
Paul's role in early Christianity has been said by some to be really the founder of Christianity, but really the message he proclaimed was that of Jesus himself. He wrote half of the New Testament. 13 books are attributed to Paul. He established churches all the way from Antioch to Rome, and these became the foundation for later Christianity.
St. Paul spent his life preaching in the cities of the ancient world and challenged the might of the Roman Empire. When he began, Christianity was a faith in danger of extinction. But through his efforts, it not only survived, but flourished, and eventually became one of the world's major religions.